Hi, everyone. I'm an assistant professor of modern Chinese literature and cultural history in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. And before I introduce Dr. Coderre, let me just take a brief second to thank the Center for East Asian Studies for supporting this event, and in particular, Lori Dennis for all of her help with the logistics, as well as Cherise Fung for her help with event promotion. Okay, so Dr. Laurence Coderre is, I'm very happy to share, a soon-to-be associate professor of East Asian Studies at New York University. Before this, she earned her PhD in Chinese from UC Berkeley in 2015, and then spent a year at the University of Michigan as a postdoctoral fellow at their Center for Chinese Studies. The breadth of Dr. Coderre's research and disciplinarity is reflected in the really wide variety of venues where she's published her work. This includes journals like Modern Chinese Culture or Literature and Culture, and the Journal of Chinese Cinemas, as well as the Journal of Material Culture and Comparative Studies in Society and History. She also has a number of chapters in edited volumes which further demonstrate her range. One of the volumes is titled Maoist Laughter. A second is 1968 and Global Cinema. And the third is on sound. It's on listening to China's cultural revolution. Today, she'll be talking to us about her recently published book, The Newborn Socialist Things, Materiality in Maoist China, which came out last August with Duke University Press. I had the pleasure first of reading the introduction and the lead up to an AAS panel on things in modern Chinese culture that we did last year. And at that time, I resolved to invite Dr. Coderre to speak to us here at Wisconsin. And I feel totally affirmed by this after reading the rest of her book with my students this spring. So it's really a pleasure to have her here to discuss it with our community more broadly. And just before I turn it over, let me finally say one thing about the format. So after Dr. Coderre is done speaking, we'll of course have an open Q&A session. You'll have chances to ask about anything, and then we'll go until about 5:30. So then without further ado, please join me now in welcoming Dr. Coderre.
Thank you so much, Anatoly, for the lovely introduction. Thank you also to Lori for setting everything up. Hopefully you can see that. Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be in Wisconsin, if only virtually, to speak to you about my work, and hopefully maybe not only sort of the book that Anatoly mentioned, but some of the directions that I'm hoping to go now that the book is out. But we'll take it one step at a time. So I'd be remiss not to start by the publication itself. My publisher will be very pleased. As Anatoly mentioned, it's out from Duke University Press. Came out in August, based on my dissertation and research undertaken over a considerable period of time in various places in the PRC, frequenting flea markets along with libraries and museums. But what I want to start with today, as I start the book itself, is with a story about socks, taken from a quite remarkable volume from 1974 called Storm at the Counter. You see the cover here. It's a collection of short stories supposedly written by the Shanghai #1 Department Composition Group. And it comprises what are pegged as fictionalized accounts of retailers' experiences working at this state-owned department store. And it represents the ardent spirit of customer service that included not only selling goods, but repairing, replacing, renting, and recycling them as well. At the time, the store was said to offer over 180 such services, ranging from advice on stain removal to collecting spent toothpaste tubes. So one of these stories, my personal favorite, is called Pairing Socks, Paywaz. And it's a story that tells of a new student worker in the sock department who arrives just as a new service is getting off the ground. And that service is one wherein customers can come in with a lone sock, the other one having been worn to the point of no longer being darnable or otherwise lost. They can bring in this leftover sock and have it matched according to color, yes, but also size, thread count, thickness, length of cuff, pattern, etc. And the idea here is that then the customer could come back a few days later and they would have a pair now for its implied half the price. It turns out it's an exceedingly complicated, labor-intensive process to match these socks. Labor that's being used in order not to sell merchandise. In fact, in order to sell half the merchandise that would otherwise be sold. This service is like all the rest in the book, in the short story collection, pegged as a newborn socialist thing. And so this term becomes a status and indicative of something, right? And so the project that became the book was in some ways trying to figure out A, what that something is, and B, what we as thinkers and scholars might take from that something and that notion in our own work. Now, the term itself is one that's still used, right? And generally refers to just sort of something new, a kind of fad or new development in culture, technology, really anything new, right? And yet, as a term used in the Mao era, it was essentially a technical term and implied a much more specific and crucial relationship to notions of history, development, etc. So one of the sort of clearest and most important definitions of the idea of the newborn thing arises from a work, an essay by Sun Dingbo, party theorist, in 1959. Here you see it in the Guangming Daily. And his definition, ultimately the definition that gains traction, is fourfold, really. So in the first place, newborn things are understood as that which struggles against old things. Right? So they're engaged in some sort of battle, if you will. In addition, they have to forge their own path. That is to say, their newness is not superficial, right? They actually involves a kind of groundbreaking. That new path, that groundbreaking, needs to be, as we would expect, in accordance with developmental principles. Again, what does that mean within the context of this essay in 1959? Well, the developmental principles have to do with the expectations of a Marxist stagist history, wherein socialism is followed by communist utopia. So we're developing in a particular teleological direction, right? And then fourth, that future path that they point to needs to be a lengthy one. That is to say that this isn't a flash in the pan. It's new and it has legs, headed again in the right, quote unquote, direction. Now, what this means then when we put all this together is that newborn things are part of, in this formulation, a developmental dialectic with old things. And that dialectic is ultimately at the very heart of historical progress and forward movement, again, in a teleological framework here. That puts, again, newborn things at the very core of the sort of Maoist cosmological historical order. And we need to regard them as such. Also, as a corollary to that, newborn socialist things remind us by their structure that socialism itself as a thing, as the youth say, it's what's understood as the interim, right? As temporary, as a transitional period that brought together temporarily necessary vestiges of the past, that is the old things, with the inchoate developments of the future, that is the newborn things. Right? So we have this juxtaposition that defines socialism for a developmental dialectic as transitional, as interim. Right? So it's a combination of these things, the juxtaposition that defines socialism as a liminal age, right? Where the trick is learning to distinguish that which was retrograde in order to keep it in check from that which was progressive in order to encourage its growth, right? And so this brings us to the responsibility of the individual to do what? To intervene in this process of development by discerning, right, the difference between, as I said, the retrograde from the progressive, and then having made that assessment, to then support the progressive element, to support the newborn things that point the way to the future, that represent, in fact, the future in the present. So we have examples of this. Skipping ahead here to an article from People's Daily in March 75, right, which calls on people to support 支持形成事物 in the context of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So we have the definition, as you see here, of social development, that is, of historical progress, as a developmental dialectic between newborn things and old things. Right? Straightforward enough. But what, in the final analysis, does this term encompass? Right? What does it comprise? And here we get a list, which is helpful and illuminating, right? These examples of newborn socialist things include cadres, workers, soldiers, peasants, students, and merchants taking the May 7 road, educated youth going up to the mountains and down to the countryside, collectivized healthcare, and barefoot doctors, workers, peasants, and soldiers participating in theory groups, and so on. So what a list like this, and there are many, or indeed the stories in the volume I began this talk with, well, all this should alert us to is the fact that, in a sense, neither old nor newborn things were particularly thing-like. Indeed, they were remarkably unthing-like. More precisely, we might say that they tested, stretched, and exceeded the bounds of materiality. And so this is the part that sort of gets me to turn from the historical question of what is this term, how is it being used, what work is it doing as a historical matter, to a kind of inspiration of a tool to think with and through. And in that sense, I come to the conclusion that the promise of the newborn thing, the newborn socialist thing, lies in its structure as a constellation of objects and bodies brought into relation with each other, of institutions produced by and through those objects and bodies, and of the social formations that they help to construct. So these constellations wind up being the inspiration, I guess, for the way the book is put together. You see the content here and the connections that I seek to trace. So there are 6 chapters and an epilogue. in the first instance, I begin with sound and take a look at the sonic imaginary. So the way that sound produces space, territory, and participates in the production of the nation during the Cultural Revolution. Chapter 2 looks at retail and the particular figure of the salesperson, right, whose job involves selling goods, commodities for the revolution, in the name of the revolution. Chapter 3 considers productivist display. So the way that displays of goods, of commodities, was to be understood as an ode to production, as opposed to an emblem of consumption. So how does that particular inversion work or fail to work? Chapter 4 takes that question and pushes it into the realm of political economy and political economic theory. So what kind of work does political economy as a form of knowledge production play? What role does it play? And how does it fit within an understanding of commodities and materiality? Chapter 5 looks at bodies, bodies as media in the remaking of, or in the production of, heroes, right? A nation of heroes in the mold of the Yambanshi. And chapter 6 ends with a look at vanity mirrors, mirrors as a kind of object that facilitates a particular understanding of the individual in relation to other media, and how that connectedness, those constellations are given structure and made legible within a particular cultural historical moment. So that ultimately is sort of the work that I do. It's not meant to be exhaustive, obviously, but it does draw, as I said, inspiration from what the newborn thing could have been, what it was, I believe, meant to be, insofar as it's, at the best of times, in its sort of utopian formulation, was meant to bring together the social and the material, as well as language and things, together in relation with one another in a way that was radically different from, read better than, the mode of relationality associated with capitalism, right? Why are newborn things better than old things? Because they point the way to the future. What does that mean? Among other things, it means exploring new modes of relationality. In the formation of these constellations. So relationality ultimately is at the very heart of how I understand the newborn thing and what I see as particularly useful in it as a concept and critical lens. So more specifically, right, my focus when it comes to relationality is on the prescriptive form of relationality, constitutive of both the commodity form and the material construction of Chinese socialist culture. So what do I mean by that? The promise of the newborn thing is that it's better than the commodity at bringing the social and the material, the linguistic and the thingly together. The problem is trying to figure out what that means and how to escape the commodity in that formulation. And as a historical matter, I argue that that project failed repeatedly, and therefore there is a tie between the formation of socialist culture and what we see after the end of the Mao period. So just for reasons of time, I'm gonna sort of gloss over this a little bit in saying that the way that I approach the issue of relationality, beyond what I've already said, and as a way to try to avoid a kind of abstraction and ahistorical framing of these problems, is to focus on the particular forms of mediation. So the cultural and historical specificities of how these relations are brought about and structured in ways that as I said when I went through the chapter outline, sort of gives you a sense overall of the material world in which we're discussing. As I said, all of this involves in one way or another the issue of the commodity form. This is surprising to some because it seems somehow anathema to the socialist project. And that's true, but also not, in the sense that, again, socialism as interim means grappling with the continued existence of the commodity, even knowing that or believing that there will be no commodities under communism. So being sort of stuck in this situation where commodities persist, and yet we have to get beyond them. So how do we do that? That's what's interesting to me. And what remains, I think, deeply relevant to the way that we all should be, how's that for prescriptive, thinking about contemporary capitalism as well, right? How do we get out of, get beyond, get better than the world in which we find ourselves, surrounded by, yes, commodities and commodity consumption. So I am focused, obviously, on the particular material articulations of this problem during the Cultural Revolution. It is front of mind for the historical actors that I look at, and for it structures the relations that I unearth, right? But the issue of the commodity and its limits is something that should inform us all, it seems to me, and it's of continuing relevance. So that's where I am now. In talking about moving forward, one of the things I'm interested in is precisely this nexus of the theory and the everyday. And so that continues to sort of excite me and intrigue me. And that's where I'm headed. So I'll just leave it there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know a number of our audience including myself, have read this. So I think the way we'll do this is, if you have a question for Dr. Coderre, just use the raise hand function, and we'll just let you ask in the order that people raise their hands. And maybe while people are getting their thoughts together, I can start by raising a question which was prompted in our seminar after we read the first half of the book. And one student said, how does this apply to a very prominent representation of a thing in this retrospective film about the socialist era in the 90s? I'm talking about To Live, Zhang Yimou's To Live, which has just a lot of great details about socialist material culture in it. But it really features prominently one thing, which is the pig iron produced in these backyard furnaces during the Great Leap Forward. And it seems to be both a kind of promise behind the newborn socialist thing, right? Because it's being produced under the auspices of this kind of jump towards communism. At the same time, it's useless, and it really avoids, it lacks a lot of the characteristics of the commodity, right? Here you have something that has no exchange value ultimately, right? So it's a kind of stillborn socialist thing in a way. And so the student brought this up as sort of, what do we do with this within the schema of newborn socialist things? And so I guess the question would be, how do you read that? How do you read pig iron? Is it sort of an intimate other to the newborn socialist thing, or does it just, does it fall outside of the discourse entirely, or what? But yeah.
Wow. I really like the idea of a stillborn socialist thing. That's kind of awesome. And I think sort of captures the issue, because the problem with the backyard furnaces isn't that the pig iron they produce has no exchange value. It's that it has no use value. Right? And so they're stillborn in that sense, right? That the commodity form is so powerful precisely because of its duality, right? It's the source of its allure, right? It gives rise to commodity fetishism, and allows commodities to circulate while still fulfilling needs, very real needs that the regime is very much aware of. And it's that need that continues to, or that informs the recognition for the continued need to have commodities, right? During the Great Leap Forward, you have these utopian moments where people are talking about getting rid of money, right, in one fell swoop. And then you have this sort of back and forth where you say, no, we're not quite ready for that yet. And so there's the push and pull within that duality of exchange value and use value. And in that case, right, yes, you succeed in getting out of the exchange value trap, but at the cost of usefulness, right? It becomes a thing that engages, produces, enacts new forms of relationality, but for no purpose whatsoever, right? And so therefore fails the test in that sense. Does that answer sort of?
Yeah, definitely. That's super helpful for positioning this very odd object, which at the same time, both seem sort of counter to these, but then also engaging with some of the utopianism behind it. So I've been waiting to ask that for a couple of months, so thank you. Okay, so I see Viren Murthy has his hand up, so there.
Hello, it's good to see you. Yeah, hi. I enjoyed this presentation and the parts of the books I read. I haven't had as thorough of a discussion because I should probably sit in on Anatoly's class and get a more kind of complete discussion of this. But just judging on the parts I've read and listening to your presentation, there's a question that came to mind, and that has to do with something you already touched on, and that is the relationship between thing and commodity. Because as you said, I mean, there's a important distinction, and that you have, in some sense, the thing, especially the new socialist thing, as being both sort of related to the commodity, but also in a kind of competition with the commodity. And there's sort of two issues that emerge here, and that is because there's such a wide variety of what comes under the socialist thing, right? I mean, you have barefoot doctors, I forget some of the other examples that you gave, but like I think the people's communes, a lot of these things are actually, I mean, with the very concept of 事物, right? I mean, they're actually processes, or even they're actions to some extent as well, right? And so in that case, the question that immediately emerges is the relationship between things and subjectivity, right? Because there seems to be a certain type of subjectivity associated with some of these things, and that could explain also the kind of movement that you're talking about, because there, as you said, the socialist thing is actually something, it's not static, it's pointing to the future. And part of what's pointing to that future is that these things themselves are, in some sense, a certain kind of labor, right? Like if you think about people's communes, of course, that's connected to labor. If you're thinking about barefoot doctors, that's a certain kind of labor that in some sense is moving towards socialism, right? And as you were saying, and so that I think is the real issue, that to really think about, I mean, you're asking in some sense a very fundamental question, like what is a thing? I mean, so many people have asked that, but how do you situate that in socialism so that you have, in some sense, certain things that embody subjectivity? But then on the other side, right, and this is the other side of the same question, right, is you have subjectivity, but on the other side you have reification, right? You get the problem of, and that is what's connected to what you're talking about, fetishism and so on, so that what can happen in reification is that the subjective dimension of this sort of processual becomes bracketed. And you could say that might even happen even in a socialist context where, with the, when all of a sudden you're not attacking the process, but you're attacking a part, like, a certain thing that comes to represent the four olds or something like that, right? So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that. So the relationship between socialist things, subjectivity, and the problem of reification. So I'm not sure if I made my
Oh,
question.
is that all? No, I mean, I think yes to all of that. I think I would say, what would I say? This is the tricky thing, right? That reification is this sort of looming danger that pertains to the commodity per Marx, right? But arguably is emblematic or symptomatic of, in fact, even a bigger issue of, as I put it, the social and the material, or the language and thing. Right? And so there's always this urge, tendency to obfuscate subjectivity through materiality, or vice versa. And yet the goal, well, not and yet, the goal is to think those two sort of buckets simultaneously, right? To think them together at once in a way that, right, that forestalls the threat of reification, to associate with the commodity as a particular kind of social structure and relation, but also just sort of more broadly. And I guess that to me is what makes this predicament sort of interesting, right? Is that it's a commodity problem, but it's more than a commodity problem. But the commodity problem, it's sort of a subset of a bigger set of issues. And so there's always this attempt to sort of get beyond the commodity and then hitting up against the same or very similar issues, and then sort of landing right back in like Commodityville all over again. And that to me is really intriguing slash depressing. And I'm going to stop there because I don't really have anything more constructive to say. thank
No, thank
you
you.
for the question.
No, thank you. That was helpful. I should, I don't want, I mean, I can keep talking about this, so I'll probably let other people come into this. But
Sure.
thank you. It's great to.
Thanks, Ren. Maybe we'll have time to circle back. Yeah, okay. I have another hand from Yuji.
Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I have just two quick questions. The first is about the gender issue. That is how female engaged with commodities in highly socialist period. For example, in your first chapter, there is a picture about two female broadcasters in the field, and in the chapter 2, there is the story you investigate is Xiangyang Shandian, right? And the daughter of the manager Xiangyang stores wants to be a sales girl. So I'm very curious. Could you tell a little bit more about how female engaged with comedy or commodification in a highly socialist period? The second question is about in your book, you try to argue that the material culture of Cultural Revolution actually proves the way for commodification in contemporary China. So there is a very clear continuity, but I also very curious, are there any discontinuities, and how do you define or how to say how to define the term commodification in highly socialist period or in post-Mao period? Yeah.
Okay, that's 3 questions. All right, the gender issue. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I don't necessarily have a great answer, except that I don't think it's an accident that there is this anxiety about women's susceptibility to commodification and to sort of shopping, right, as a problem of morality, in fact, right, that it is linked to the development of the department store in France, to the modern girl as a global sort of phenomenon, and figure to women and advertising. I mean, there is a sort of nexus there that is ripe with anxiety and agita. And so from that perspective, it sort of makes sense that women would feature so prominently in efforts to restructure, avoid, surpass commodity relations, right? Not necessarily from a production standpoint, although that too requires a kind of remaking, right? So iron girl as laborer, but slash and also on the consumption side. So women as mediating figures for proper forms of consumption in the retail space, for example, or proper use of mirrors, right? Not for the application of cosmetics, but for appropriately revolutionary behaviors. That's not really a fully formed thought, but that's sort of where I would head with that. Discontinuity. Yeah. So I suppose the biggest discontinuity for me is probably the agita quotient and the hand wringing, right? So the problem is the same. In the 70s and the 80s, the 90s, it's a little bit different, but right before the Southern tour in 92, for example, there's a sense of like, how are we going to square this particular circle of like revolution and commodity production, consumption, right? That problem is the same from 49 on, because the Communist Party is still claiming, right, that we're headed for communism. We're taking a bit of a detour, but we're getting there eventually, right? And so because of that, all of the temporal reverberations of that and the sense of liminality and the sense of the temporary sort of arises, right, from that formulation. But there's like a tremendous sense of fear articulated during the Cultural Revolution about the threat of failure, right? That the revolution will be curtailed, that the commodity will win in sort of pulling history backward. And that's a really big problem, right? But like the 80s, it's like, yeah, so we take a detour, right? And then by the 90s, it's like, maybe we never get there. We just won't say it, right? And so the level of hand wringing changes. The level of sort of anxiety and energy that's put into this issue changes, is sort of historically specific, I think. Not to mention the kind of the for lack of a better term, the material realities in a given moment, right? And so today I've spoken almost exclusively in terms of like generalities and abstractions. Think that aspect of a book that will travel outside of Chinese studies the furthest. But everything is meant to be grounded in a particular cultural and historical milieu and material milieu. So that changes, right? Before and after, or during and after the Mao period. Okay, the third one, definitions of commodification. I avoid defining them myself, these terms. I rely instead on political economic texts of the Cultural Revolution, because that's more interesting to me, A, and B, because it means that I can avoid answering that question. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yuji. Other questions?
Am I off the hook?
No, not quite yet. We have to give people a chance to catch up. Well, actually, it's a small follow-up to Yuji's question about discontinuity versus continuity. What do you call the period, since you're making I think a very strong case for continuity, right? But what do you call the period after the Cultural Revolution? I mean, what's your preferred name?
I call it the period after the Cultural Revolution. It's a good question. I usually just call it post-Mao. Just a little bit of a cop-out.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, yeah, any choices? Yeah.
It's descriptive more than conceptual. Okay, I'm also kind of lying. I do have fun with, or have spent time toying with the idea of post-socialism as a thing. In order to do something more than or other than description as a matter of chronology. So to the extent that I would do that, I think that would probably be my go-to sort of analytic but as I say in the book, I mean, because of the conversation that I'm participating in, it makes more sense for me to emphasize continuity than discontinuity. Right, so it's more a kind of rhetorical strategy than anything else, maybe, right? Because I think there is an investment in discontinuity for a number of reasons, and so the kind of corrective is on the continuity side of the ledger still, even though like for years people have been shouting from the rooftops that like 49 is not a break, 76 is not a break. It doesn't matter. It's like continues to be worth saying.
Well, I think it's one of the book's greatest, I don't want to say virtues, but greatest effects on the reader is the aha moment behind the continuity, and the fact that the commodity just never went away, or the commodity in the guise of the new socialist, of the newborn socialist thing just doesn't go away, and that it sort of lays the ground for what comes after. So now we have a chance to circle back to Varen then, since he has another question. So take it away.
You can't get rid of me. Yeah, thank you. I mean, what the reason, my question is just a follow-up to some of what's already been said, and something that Anatoly said about, continuity, discontinuity. I mean, because I think from what I've listened to and what I've read, I think I can read you in both directions. And I was thinking that because the continuity argument, would say that, okay, what happens in the Maoist period is that, the commodity form really dominates. And I don't read you as saying that. And so you could correct me if I'm wrong. But because I think what's really important here is a tension between the concept of a thing and the concept of a commodity. And I thought that one of the things that your point was that the new socialist thing, in some sense, is an attention with the commodity, and so that in some sense the new socialist thing is actually what is the hope for a kind of socialism. I mean, the hope for going beyond the commodity, and then you get into the whole problem. You have to get into the whole problem of the specific situation that China is in historically, where was never fully commodified, right? And so that's where you get into the whole problem of the transition and so on. So that from that perspective, the Mao period, the socialist thing in the Mao period, could look very different from the socialist thing in the post. I mean, even if the socialist thing is, whether that's still even a thing. I mean, but that's another question. But I mean, there you could see, depending on how one theorizes the post-Mao period, and so that I think is the question, whether one sees the post-Mao period as a period of actually much more commodification, right? Which I think most people would. Yeah. Especially, so then the whole question lies in whether there's really a possibility of socialism in that period. I mean, because I mean, the way I heard you talking about it as a failed project, but I don't think what you're saying is that it was a doomed project, right? And I think that I think would be what really sort of strikes the nail in the coffin, right? Where that is where it's total continuity, where it was fundamentally doomed, right? And that would be there are different people who had different positions where you could say that. You could say, oh, because productive forces weren't advanced enough or whatever, that it had to go into this direction. The commodity form had to win, right? But I don't see you as quite saying that, and so that's why I thought. I mean, that's why the distinction between the thing and the commodity is really important, because thing can be much broader. I mean, one could argue that you had things before you had commodities,
Right.
and yet the commodity is a much more historically specific way in which the thing is, to use, I mean, your own words, but I mean, Marx as well. I mean, mediated, right? There's a specific mediation that makes a thing into a commodity, especially a commodity in a capitalist society. I mean, because we could go even further and say you could have commodities without capitalism as well, right? And that's why there were all those debates.
Yes.
Yeah. So that I think that's really, it's those distinctions that I think really make your work stand out. And so I just was wondering if you could say something about that.
I don't know that I have anything particularly insightful to add. Except that I think you're right. I choose to believe that it was, as you say, a failed project and not a doomed one. One of the parts of the book that I'm proudest of, weirdly, is the acknowledgements, which nobody ever reads, but please read it, somebody. But because I wrote it just after George Floyd was murdered, and I was right in the middle of COVID. Not that we're out of COVID, but in New York City, and I was sitting there going, why am I doing this? Why does it matter that I'm finally publishing a book on Cultural Revolution China when there's like a very real world on fire in so many respects. And the answer that I gave myself, which is probably somewhat diluted, but still, was that it matters for those of us who want to imagine a world differently, to consider efforts to do so that predate us. And so in that sense, it's very key that this is a failed project, but not a doomed one. And that, incidentally, is sort of my beef with someone like Karl Gertz's work. Right, that if everything is capitalism, then there is no outside, then we're all screwed, right? And that just like, that can't be the case. for me, refuse to believe that. So that means that we need to allow for the possibility of thinking otherwise, right? And this is one of these attempts to think otherwise, to have categories, terms, concepts that are, as you say, more capacious than the particular set of social relations that we associate with the commodity under capitalism. So I mean, I hope that's what the book does, if only for my own ability to sort of look at myself in the mirror. But I think that's important as a historical matter, but also as a pointing towards the future matter, right? Not in the same sense, but still one that opens up a certain form of thinking or horizons.
Thank you.
Thanks, Varen. Varen, I actually love listening to you respond to Laurence's book. I almost wish we could nudge you into writing a review of it so that we could have more of this.
I
should come and sit in on your course.
No, you don't need my course to do this. I mean, you're doing so great on your own. So, but thanks. And I mean, this is that seemed like a really nice coda, actually. Although you're talking about the acknowledgements, which comes at the beginning, but it actually seems like a really good reflective point here to stop, right? Which is to sort of think about the book's imaginative project as much as anything, and the way that it excavates this earlier imagination. So Laurence, please come back when you have your next book. This is really wonderfully instructive and inspiring, I think, for all of us. So just a really nice compliment to those of us who did read the book, and then hopefully it'll be a kind of a catalyst for those who haven't read the book to go out, get it, and to give it the time it so richly deserves. So everybody, please join me in thanking Dr. Coderre for joining us today. And again, we look forward to seeing you again down the line.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you.